Hello, my dear sleepy listeners. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight we embark on a peaceful journey through the remarkable life of Henry I of England, known to history as Beauclerc, the Scholar King. This extraordinary monarch reigned from 1100 to 1135, transforming medieval England through his wisdom, yet suffering one of history's most heartbreaking royal tragedies. We'll softly explore his rise from unlikely youngest son to powerful king, his revolutionary administrative reforms that shaped England for centuries, and the devastating loss at sea that changed everything, all while the gentle whispers of 12th century England lull you into restful sleep. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, please take a moment to like this video. If you're enjoying these soothing historical tales, I'd love to hear from you gentle souls in the comments below. Perhaps share which historical period brings you the most comfort, or simply let me know how these stories help you unwind. Don't be shy. Our Sleepy Crown family is wonderfully welcoming. And if you'd like more of these calming journeys through history's quieter, please subscribe to keep these tranquil tales coming your way. So settle in under your softest blanket, close your eyes, and let the gentle echoes of medieval England carry you toward the most peaceful dreams. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. Henry, later known as King Henry I of England, entered this world sometime around 1068 in the shadow of one of history's most momentous conquests. He was born into a family that had just torn down an ancient kingdom and rebuilt it in their own Norman image. Yet as the youngest of 4 sons, few could have predicted that this infant would one day wear the crown of England. The year of Henry's birth was still thick with the smoke of conquest. Just 2 years had passed since his father, William of Normandy, had crossed the treacherous waters of the English Channel with his army of knights, archers, and adventurers. The great victory at Hastings in 1066 had shattered the Anglo-Saxon world forever, sending King Harold Godwinson to his death with an arrow through his eye and opening England to Norman. William the Conqueror, as history would remember him, was no ordinary duke. He had spent his youth fighting for survival in the brutal politics of 11th century Normandy, where nobles changed sides like weather vanes, and a ruler's life hung by the thinnest of threads. Born illegitimate himself, William had clawed his way to power through cunning, ruthlessness, and an iron will that would become legendary. When the childless English king, Edward the Confessor, allegedly promised him the throne, William saw his chance to transform from a French duke into something far grander, a king. The conquest itself had been a masterpiece of medieval war and logistics. Assembling a fleet of over 700 ships, William had transported perhaps 10,000 men across the Channel, including his most trusted knights, Breton allies, and mercenaries from across northern France. The victory at Hastings was just the beginning. What followed was years of brutal campaigning to crush Anglo-Saxon resistance, build stone castles across the landscape, and replace an entire aristocracy with Norman lords. Into this world of transformation and violence, Henry was. His mother, Matilda of Flanders, was herself a woman of considerable importance, the daughter of Baldwin V, Count of Flanders, and descendant of the great Charlemagne himself. Her marriage to William had been one of the most significant political alliances of the bringing together the resources of Normandy and Flanders would reshape northwestern Europe. The royal household where Henry spent his earliest years was unlike ever seen. The Norman court was a restless, institution that moved constantly between the great castles and palaces of both England and Normandy. Here, French was spoken and the rhythms of life followed continental customs rather than Anglo-Saxon traditions. It was a world of stone walls instead of wooden halls, of mounted knights rather than foot soldiers, of bureaucratic efficiency rather than ancient custom. Henry's birth order would shape his entire life in ways both subtle and profound. As the fourth son, he was considered surplus to requirements in the harsh calculus of medieval inheritance. His eldest brother Robert, born around 1051, was the heir apparent to Normandy, the family's ancestral land and the source of their power. William Rufus, born around 1056, was clearly his father's favorite, destined perhaps for England if the conquest proved lasting. Even Richard, the third son, had precedence over little Henry. But fate, as it so often does, began to reshape the family's destiny even before. In 1070 or 1071, when Henry was barely a toddler, his brother Richard met his end in a hunting accident in the New Forest of southern England. The details have been lost to time, but the tragedy was a bitter reminder that even royal blood offered no protection against misfortune. Suddenly, Henry found himself elevated from fourth son to third, though still far from any realistic prospect of inheriting significant power. The world Henry was growing up in was one of constant motion and change. His father ruled not just as King of England, but as Duke of Normandy, and the demands of governing two realms separated by the unpredictable waters of the Channel meant the royal household was constantly traveling. 1 month, they might be holding court in the Great Hall at Westminster, listening to English petitioners and Anglo-Saxon nobles carefully learning to navigate the new north. The next, they could be in Rouen, the ancient capital of Normandy, dealing with rebellious French nobles or negotiating with neighboring counts. This constant movement between two worlds gave Henry a unique perspective that would serve him well in later life. Unlike his older brothers, who had been born before the conquest and whose earliest memories were of Normandy, Henry was truly a child of both realms. He witnessed firsthand how his father managed to rule two very different peoples with distinct languages, laws, and customs. He saw the delicate balance required to maintain loyalty among Norman nobles, who still saw themselves as Frenchmen, while gradually winning the acceptance of English subjects who had initially viewed all Normans as foreign oppressors. The education of a royal prince in the late 11th century was a careful balance between practical and scholarly learning. Unlike his older brothers, who had been trained primarily as warriors and rulers, Henry received what was considered an exceptionally thorough education for a medieval prince. This was partly due to his position as a younger son. While Robert and William Rufus were learning the arts of war and governance, Henry was placed in the hands of learned clerks who taught him to read and write Latin with fluency. The man most responsible for Henry's education was likely Osmond, Bishop of Salisbury, one of the most learned men of his age. Under Osmond's guidance, Henry was introduced to the classical texts that formed the foundation of medieval learning, the works of ancient philosophers, historians, and theologians that had been preserved in monastery libraries throughout the Dark Ages. He studied the Bible intensively, learning not just the stories but the complex theological interpretations that governed medieval. He was taught rhetoric and logic, the arts of persuasion and argument that were essential for any, but perhaps most importantly for his future career. Henry was introduced to the practical arts of administration, and he learned about the complex web of feudal obligations that held medieval society together, the intricate relationships between lords and vassals, kings and subjects that required constant management and careful balance. He studied the legal traditions of both Norman and English, beginning to understand how the two systems might be merged into something. This education set Henry apart from most of his contemporaries, including his own brother. While Robert and William Rufus could barely write their own names, Henry could compose in elegant Latin and engage in scholarly discussions with learned clerics. This intellectual curiosity, administrative skill, would later earn the nickname Beauclerc, the good scholar. Though some historians suggest this title was somewhat exaggerated by medieval writers who admired learned kings, The relationship between Henry and his older brothers during these formative was complex and often strained. The age gaps were significant. Robert was perhaps 17 years older, William Rufus 12 years his senior. By the time Henry was beginning his education, his brothers were already young men, accompanying their father on military campaigns and learning the practical arts of medieval rulership. This created a distance between Henry and his siblings that would have profound consequences in later years. Robert, the eldest, was already showing signs of the weakness that would eventually doom his prospects. Though brave in battle and possessed of considerable charm, he lacked the iron determination that had made his father great. Contemporary chroniclers describe him as generous to a fault, easily swayed by flattery, and prone to the kind of indecision that could be fatal in medieval politics. Even as a young man, it was becoming clear to observant courtiers that Robert might not have what it took to hold together his father's conquests. William Rufus, the second son, was cut from different cloth entirely. Like his father, he possessed the ruthless pragmatism necessary for effective kingship, but he lacked William the Conqueror's sense of justice. Even as a Rufus showed signs of the cruelty and greed that would make him one of medieval England's most hated kings. He was his father's clear, perhaps because William saw in him the strength that Robert lacked. But this favoritism would sow the seeds of future conflict. The young Henry, observing from the sidelines, lessons that his older brother. He saw how his father balanced competing interests, how he managed to maintain control over fractious nobles, how he used both carrot and stick to maintain in his realms. Most important, the value of patience and careful qualities that would serve him when his own chance for power finally came. The Norman court where Henry grew up was not just a center of political power, but a cultural melting pot where Norman, English, and broader European influences combined to create something entirely new. The great halls echoed with multiple languages. Norman French was the language of the nobility, Latin the tongue of learning and administration, and Old English still spoken by the vast majority of the population. Henry, with his scholarly inclinations, became fluent in all three, giving him a crucial advantage in understanding and communicating all elements of his future kingdom. The castle settings where Henry spent his youth were themselves symbols of the new order his father had posed. Unlike the wooden halls of Anglo-Saxon England, these were massive stone structures designed to intimidate as much as to defend. The Tower of London, begun by William shortly after his conquest, rose like a mountain of white stone beside the Thames, a constant reminder to Londoners of who now ruled them. Windsor Castle, another of William's projects, commanded the Thames Valley and controlled one of the main approaches to London. These were not just military fortifications, but statements of permanent authority. The Normans had come to stay. Within these stone walls, Henry witnessed the daily pageantry of Norman rule. He saw English nobles carefully learning Norman customs, adopting French names for their children, and gradually merging their bloodlines with their conquerors through strategic marriages. He observed the delicate negotiations between Norman bishops and English abbots, the slow process by which the Norman Church absorbed and transformed English religious traditions. He watched his father receive ambassadors from across Europe, from the Pope in Rome to the Holy Roman Emperor in Germany, as England took its place as a major European power. But perhaps most crucially, Henry learned to observe and understand the ordinary people over whom his family ruled. Unlike his brothers, who saw the English as conquered subjects to be managed, Henry developed a genuine appreciation for English customs and traditions. He learned to speak English fluently, making him probably the first Norman king to do so. He studied Anglo-Saxon law and governance, recognizing that his father's conquest had been most successful where it had adapted existing English institutions rather than simply imposing Norman ones. This understanding of both Norman and English perspectives would prove invaluable When Henry eventually became king, he would be uniquely positioned to bridge the gap between conqueror and conquered, to create a truly unified realm that drew strength from both traditions. But that lay far in the future. For now, he was simply the youngest prince, learning his lessons and waiting to see what role fate would assign him in the great drama of medieval politics. The death of Henry's father in 1087 would bring all these childhood lessons to their first practical test. William the Conqueror died as he had in the midst of conflict, having sustained mortal injuries while campaigning against rebellious French nobles in the Vexin. As the great king lay dying in a monastery, he was forced to make the most crucial decision of his reign: how to divide his conquests among his surviving sons. The decision William made would set in motion a chain of events that would define the next half-century of English and Norman history. Following Norman tradition, he divided his holdings between his sons, rather than keeping Robert, as the eldest, would inherit Normandy, the ancestral and the source of the family's legitimacy. William Rufus would receive England, the great prize of the conquest, but also the more distant and potentially unstable of the two realms. And Henry, the youngest, would receive neither land nor title, but instead a substantial sum of money, reportedly 5,000 pounds of silver, and his mother's modest estates in Buckinghamshire and Gloucestershire. This division seemed logical from William's perspective, but it contained the seeds of future catastrophe. By splitting England and Normandy, he had created an inherently unstable situation. Many of the greatest nobles held lands on both sides of the Channel. They were vassals of Robert in Normandy and of William Rufus in England. When conflicts arose between the brothers, as they inevitably would, these nobles would be forced to choose sides, potentially losing half their inheritance regardless of which brother they supported. For Henry, his father's death marked the end of his sheltered childhood and the beginning of a far more dangerous phase of his life. As the landless prince, he was dependent on the goodwill of his brothers, but he possessed something they lacked: a thorough education in the arts of government and a deep understanding of what made kingdoms stable or unstable. He had learned patience in the norm, diplomacy in dealing with conquered English, and above all, the crucial skill of waiting for the right moment to act. The teenage Henry, who emerged from his father's court in 1087, was a very different figure from the typical medieval prince. Where his contemporaries relied on sword and lance, Henry's greatest weapons were his intelligence and his understanding of the complex web of relationships that held medieval society together. He had been shaped by unique circumstances: the conquest of England, the fusion of two cultures, the need to rule diverse peoples with different traditions and expectations. As he prepared to enter the brutal world of medieval politics, Henry carried with him lessons that would prove invaluable. He understood that successful rule required more than military prowess. It demanded careful administration, diplomatic skill, and above all, the ability to win the loyalty of subjects through justice and effective governance, rather than fear alone. These insights, learned in the great halls and stone chambers of his father's revolutionary court, would eventually make him one of medieval England's most effective kings. But first, he would have to survive the coming storm. The death of William the Conqueror unleashed forces that would tear apart his carefully constructed realm. Brothers would fight brothers, nobles would switch sides with bewildering frequency, and the very survival of Norman rule in England would hang in the balance. In this chaos, Henry would find his opportunity, not through inheritance or favor, but through intelligence, patience, almost ruthless pragmatism learned at his father's knee. The unexpected prince was about to begin his long journey toward the years following William the Conqueror's death in 1087 plunged England and Normandy into a period of chaos that would test every lesson Henry had learned during his protected childhood. As the youngest son with no land to call his own, he found himself navigating the treacherous waters of medieval politics, with only his wit and his inheritance of silver to sustain him. The problems began almost immediately. Robert, now Duke of Normandy, and William Rufus, crowned King of England, discovered that their father's division of the inheritance was practically unworkable. The great Norman families who had conquered England, alongside William, held estates on both sides of the Channel. When disputes arose between the brothers, as they inevitably did, these nobles faced an impossible choice: support Robert and risk losing their English lands, or back William Rufus and forfeit their Norman heritage. Henry, with his 5,000 pounds of silver and his modest English estates, initially tried to maintain neutrality between his warring brothers, but neutrality proved impossible in the brutal mathematics of medieval politics. When William Rufus moved quickly to confiscate Henry's English inheritance, claiming that as the landless brother, Henry might use his wealth to support Robert's cause, Henry was forced to make his first crucial political decision. Rather than flee to some distant court to seek sanctuary, Henry chose to throw his lot in with Robert. It was a calculated risk, but one that offered the possibility of gaining real power. Robert desperately needed Henry's silver to hire mercenaries. More importantly, he needed allies he could trust in his struggles with rebellious Norman. In exchange for Henry's support and financing, Robert made a promise that would change the course of English history. He would grant Henry the county of Cotentin, a substantial territory in western Normandy. The Cotentin Peninsula, stretching into the English Channel from the Norman coast, was a prize worth fighting for. Its strategic position commanded the sea routes between England, and its fertile lands supported a substantial population. More importantly, it would give Henry what he had never possessed: a power base of his own, complete with castles, knights, and the revenues necessary to play the game of politics as an independent actor rather than a dependent. But gaining control of the Cotentin proved far more challenging than he had anticipated. The region was a patchwork of authorities, ancient and shifting law that reflected the broader chaos engulfing the world. Local nobles who had sworn allegiance to Robert often maintained private armies and pursued their own agenda. The church, with its vast land holdings and network of monasteries, represented another center of power that could not be. Most dangerously, Bishop Odo of Bayeux, William the Conqueror's half-brother and one of the most powerful figures in Normandy, viewed Henry's sudden elevation with deep suspicion. Bishop Odo, a formidable opponent, a warrior priest who had fought at Hastings and accumulated immense wealth and power during the conquest of England. He saw in Henry a potential threat to his own influence over Robert, and perhaps more troubling, a young man whose intelligence and administrative skills might one day challenge the established order of Norman nobility. When Henry arrived in Normandy to claim his new territories, Odo was waiting with a trap. The details of Henry's capture and imprisonment remain somewhat murky, filtered through the accounts of chroniclers who wrote years later and often had their own political agendas. What seems clear is that Odo convinced Robert that Henry was secretly negotiating with William Rufus, playing both brothers against each other for his own advantage. Whether this accusation had any basis in truth hardly mattered. Medieval politics operated on suspicion and preemption as much as proven fact. Henry found himself imprisoned in the grim fortress of Neuilly-la-Forêt, his dreams of independent power seemingly crushed before they had barely begun. The young prince, who had been trained in the arts of scholarship and diplomacy, was learning a harsher lesson about the realities of medieval. In the damp stone cells of Neuilly, surrounded by guards loyal to Bishop Odo, Henry had ample time to reflect on his mistakes and plan for an uncertain future. But Henry's imprisonment also revealed qualities that his enemies had underestimated. Rather than despairing or attempting some desperate escape, he used his time in captivity to think, to plan, and to carefully observe the political currents swirl around him. He maintained his dignity, refused to break under pressure, and most importantly, continued to cultivate relationships with Norman nobles who visited the fortress. His scholarly training proved valuable. His ability to converse in Latin with visiting clerics, to discuss philosophy and law with learned nobles, gradually won him a reputation as a prince of unusual ability and character. The intervention that secured Henry's release came from an unexpected source, the Norman nobility itself. Many of the great lords who had initially supported Odo's move against Henry began to have second thoughts. They recognized that Robert desperately needed capable allies in his struggles with rebellious nobles and his ongoing conflict with Rufus. More pragmatically, they understood that Henry's silver and his potential as a military leader were resources that Normandy could ill afford to waste locked away in a prison cell. The pressure for Henry's release built gradually through the winter of 1088 to 1089. Respected nobles approached Robert privately, arguing that his youngest brother posed no real threat, but could be a valuable ally if properly managed. Church leaders, many of whom had been impressed by Henry's scholarly accomplishments, added their voices to the chorus calling for his freedom. Most importantly, the military situation in Normandy continued to deteriorate, making Robert increasingly desperate for loyal supporters who could actually deliver results on the battlefield. When Henry finally emerged from Neuilly-la-Forêt in the spring of 1080, he was a changed man. The months of imprisonment had burned away any remaining innocence about the nature of medieval politics. He had learned that survival required not just intelligence and diplomatic skill, but also the ability to project strength and inspire fear in potential enemies. The scholarly prince was beginning his transformation into a ruthless and effective king. His first priority was rebuilding his power base in western Normandy. Though he no longer held the formal title of Count of Cotentin, Henry still controlled substantial resources and maintained relationships with local nobles who respected his capabilities. He established his headquarters at Domfront, a strategically important castle that controlled one of the key routes between Normandy and the neighboring regions of Maine and Anjou. Domfront was perfectly suited to Henry's needs. Its massive stone walls and commanding position made it virtually impregnable to direct assault, while its location allowed Henry to interfere with trade routes and communications throughout western Normandy. More importantly, the inhabitants of Domfront had grown tired of the chaos and weak rule that characterized Robert's duchy. They welcomed Henry as a leader who promised stability and effective governance. From Domfront, Henry began the patient work of building what chroniclers would later call his court-in-waiting. He gathered around him a carefully chosen group of ambitious young nobles, capable administrators and military commanders who shared his vision of effective governance. These men, many of them younger sons like himself, who had been overlooked by the established hierarchy, would later form the core of his royal administration when he finally gained the throne. The group that assembled around Henry at Domfront was remarkable for its diversity and talent. There was Roger of Salisbury, a brilliant administrator who would later revolutionize the English financial system. William de Warr, a military commander of exceptional skill, who understood both the new castle-based war and the traditional cavalry tactics that had won at Hastings. Ranulph Flambard, a churchman whose understanding of canon law and theology was matched by his political acumen. These men and others like them were attracted to Henry not by promises of him, but by his reputation for competence and his potential for future greatness. What set Henry's emerging court apart from the typical medieval noble household was its emphasis on merit over birth. While Henry certainly understood the importance of noble bloodlines and traditional feudal relationships, he also recognized that effective governance required skilled professionals who could manage complex administrative and military challenges. This willingness to promote talent regardless of social origin would later become one of the defining characteristics of his reign as king. The military situation in Normandy during the early 1090s provided Henry with numerous opportunities to demonstrate his capabilities as a leader. Robert's weak rule had encouraged rebellion among major nobles, while his ongoing conflict with William Rufus created constant instability along the Norman borders. Henry found himself repeatedly called upon to help suppress revolts, defend strategic positions, and negotiate truces between competing factions. One of the most significant of these conflicts came in November 1090, when a major uprising erupted in Rouen, the capital of Normandy. A wealthy merchant named Conan Pilatus had organized a rebellion against Robert's rule, taking control of much of the city and threatening to invite English intervention. The revolt represented a fundamental challenge to ducal authority and had to be suppressed quickly before it spread to other urban centers. Robert, characteristically, hesitated to act decisively against the rebels. He seemed genuinely uncertain whether to negotiate with Conan or crush the rebellion by force. It was Henry who provided the resolution that his elder brother lacked. Arriving in Rouen with a small but disciplined force, Henry quickly assessed the situation and developed a plan to retake the city through a combination of military pressure and political maneuvering. The urban warfare that followed was brutal and chaotic, with rebels and loyalists fighting house by house through the narrow streets of medieval Rouen. Henry personally led the assault on the rebels' stronghold, demonstrating the kind of physical courage that was essential for medieval leadership. But it was his handling of the aftermath that truly marked him as a future king. When Conan Pilatus was finally captured, many expected Henry to execute him immediately as an example to other potential rebels. Instead, Henry made a decision that was both calculated and theatrical. He had Conan brought to the top of Rouen Castle, the highest point in the city, where the assembled crowd could witness what would happen next. Then, despite Conan's desperate offers to pay an enormous ransom for his life, Henry personally threw the rebel leader from the castle walls to his death on the stones below. The execution of Conan was a masterpiece of medieval political theater. It demonstrated Henry's strength and determination while sending an unmistakable message to other potential rebels about the cost of defying legitimate authority. But it also revealed something darker about Henry's character, a willingness to use extreme violence when he deemed it necessary, and an understanding that sometimes the most effective way to prevent future bloodshed was to make a terrible example of present enemies. Contemporary chroniclers praised Henry's handling of the Rouen rebellion, noting that his decisive action had restored order to the duchy and enhanced Robert's authority. But they also recognized that Henry had emerged from the conflict with enhanced prestige and a growing reputation as a military leader. The youngest prince was no longer simply Robert's dependent ally. He was becoming a power in his own right. This growing independence inevitably created tensions with Robert, who began to worry that Henry's success might overshadow his own authority as duke. The situation was made more complicated by Henry's obvious administrative and military superiority. Where Robert was indecisive, Henry acted quickly and effectively. Where Robert showed mercy that was interpreted as weakness, Henry demonstrated a combination of justice and strength that won respect from nobles and commoners alike. The breaking point came in 1091, when William Rufus launched a major invasion of Normandy with the goal of reunifying his father's domains under English rule. Faced with this external threat, Robert was forced to choose between continuing his partnership with Henry or attempting to appease William Rufus through a separate peace that would necessarily sacrifice his younger brother's interests. Robert chose appeasement. In early 1091, he signed the Treaty of Rouen with William Rufus, agreeing to terms that effectively abandoned Henry to face the English king's wrath alone. The treaty granted William Rufus extensive territories in eastern Normandy, while promising him Robert's support in any future conflict. Most ominously for Henry, the agreement specifically excluded him from any protection and nominated Robert and William as each other's heir, formally cutting Henry out of the succession entirely. The betrayal by his elder brother marked a crucial turning point. He could no longer rely on family loyalty or traditional feudal obligations to protect his interests. From this point forward, he would have to depend entirely on his own resources and abilities. The lesson was a harsh one, but it completed Henry's education of medieval politics. Faced with the combined forces of both his brothers, Henry made a strategic withdrawal to the fortress monastery of Mont Saint-Michel, one of the most defensible positions in Normandy. The great abbey, built on a tidal island off the Norman coast, was surrounded by treacherous sands and dangerous currents that made it impossible to assault. Henry prepared to make his last stand as an independent power in politics. The siege of Mont Saint-Michel became one of the most celebrated episodes in Henry's early career. Chroniclers describe how he and his small band of followers held out for months against the combined armies of his brothers, refusing all offers of surrender and maintaining their defiance even as supplies ran low. The siege became a symbol of Henry's determination and his refusal to accept defeat, even in the most desperate circumstances. But perhaps more importantly, the siege demonstrated Henry's growing political sophistication. Even while under attack, he maintained communication with nobles throughout Normandy and England, building networks of support that would prove crucial in future conflicts. He used the drama of the siege to present himself as the victim of his brother's ambition, winning sympathy from those who admired courage in the face of overwhelming odds. The end of the siege came not through military defeat, but through a characteristic piece of Henry's political maneuvering. As winter approached and his water supply dwindled, Henry entered into secret negotiations for a face-saving surrender that would allow him to leave Mont Saint-Michel with his honor intact. The exact terms of this agreement remain unclear, but Henry emerged from the siege with his reputation enhanced rather than damaged. His next destination was Brittany, and from there into the broader political landscape of 11th century France. As an exile from Normandy, Henry might have seemed finished as a significant political figure. Instead, his years of wandering and struggle were about to provide him with the experience and connections that would eventually make him King of England. The road from Mont Saint-Michel to Westminster would prove long and dangerous, marked by betrayals, battles, and countless moments when Henry's survival hung by a thread. But the young prince, who had learned his first lessons in the stone halls of his father's court, was now being educated in a far harsher school. Each setback taught him new lessons about power and survival, while each small victory added to his growing reputation as a leader who might one day restore stability to the fractured world. The path to power had begun in earnest when Henry finally secured his position as King of England in August 1100. He faced challenges that would have daunted even the most experienced ruler. The kingdom he inherited was fractured by decades of brutal taxation under William Rufus, threatened by his brother Robert's competing claim from Normandy, and suspicious of yet another Norman king who might prove as tyrannical as his predecessor. But Henry possessed something that set him apart from other medieval monarchs, a vision of what effective government could achieve and the intellectual tools to transform that vision into reality. The coronation itself, hastily arranged just 3 days after William Rufus's death in the New Forest, provided Henry's first opportunity to demonstrate his understanding of English political expectations. Rather than simply claiming the throne by right of conquest, as as his father and brother had done, Henry chose to issue a formal Charter of Liberties that promised to address the grievances that had made Rufus so deeply. This charter was far more than a political expedient. It was a sophisticated document that Henry's grasp legal and constitutional principles that governed medieval kingship. He promised to end the arbitrary taxation that had emptied noble coffers and impoverished the church. He committed to respecting the ancient customs and laws of England, both Anglo-Saxon traditions and the Norman innovations that had proved beneficial. Most importantly, he established the principle that royal power, while absolute in scope, should be exercised according to law rather than mere whim. But promises on parchment meant nothing without the ability to enforce them, and Henry's early months as king were dominated by the urgent need to build a government capable of managing the complex realm he had inherited. Here, his years of careful observation during his father's reign, his education in administrative law, and his experience managing his own territories in Normandy all proved invaluable. The royal household that Henry assembled around himself was unlike anything England had seen before. While maintaining the traditional structure of medieval court life, the great officers of state, the ceremonial positions, the elaborate rituals of kingship, Henry infused his administration with a new emphasis on competence and efficiency. The men he chose to serve as his principal advisors were selected not for their noble bloodlines or military prowess, but for their ability to solve the practical problems of governing a complex kingdom. At the heart of this new system was the royal treasury, housed in the ancient capital of Winchester. Here Henry installed a revolutionary new method of financial administration that would transform not just English government, but the entire medieval understanding of royal finance. The system, which later historians would call the Exchequer, represented one of the most sophisticated examples of bureaucratic organization in medieval Europe. The genius of Henry's financial system lay in its combination of careful record-keeping, systematic auditing, and decentralized collection, rather than relying on the haphazard methods of previous reigns, where royal revenues might disappear into the pockets of corrupt officials or simply go uncollected. Henry created a network of accountability that stretched from the royal court to the smallest village. At the center of this network was Roger of Salisbury, the low-born cleric whom Henry elevated to become one of the most powerful men in England. Roger's background was humble. He was the son of a minor Norman priest with no claim to noble status, but his mathematical abilities and understanding of complex accounting principles made him irreplaceable to Henry's administrative revolution. Under Roger's management, the royal treasury began producing the first systematic records of government income and expenditure in English history. These records, known as the pipe rolls, from their distinctive method of storage, provide us with an unprecedented window into the workings of Henry's government. They reveal a kingdom where every source of royal revenue was carefully monitored, where local officials were held accountable for their collections, and where the king himself maintained detailed knowledge of his realm's financial health. The first surviving pipe roll from the year 1130, near the end of Henry's reign, shows a government that was collecting and managing revenues that dwarfed those of any previous English monarch. But Henry's administrative innovations extended far beyond financial management. He also revolutionized the English legal system, creating new institutions and procedures that would form the foundation of English common law. The king established a system of itinerant justices, royal judges who traveled regular circuits throughout the kingdom, bringing consistent royal justice to even the most remote regions. These traveling judges represented a fundamental break with previous practice, where justice had been largely a local matter administered by individual lords according to their own customs and interests. Henry's justices carried with them standardized legal procedures, consistent penalties for common crimes, and most importantly, the authority to override local traditions when they conflicted with royal law. This system not only improved the actual administration of justice throughout the kingdom, but also strengthened royal authority by making every English subject directly aware of the king's power and concern for their welfare. The intellectual foundation for these legal reforms lay in Henry's own education and his continued patronage of scholarly activity. The king maintained close relationships with the leading legal scholars of his time, encouraging them to develop systematic treatises on law and government that could guide the work of his administrators. His court became a center of learning where Norman legal traditions were carefully combined with Anglo-Saxon customs to create something entirely new, a unified English legal system that drew strength from both traditions while being beholden to neither. Henry's personal involvement in these scholarly activities was remarkable for a medieval king. Contemporary chronicles describe him participating in lengthy discussions about legal principles, personally reviewing complex cases that came before the royal court, and even contributing to the development of new legal procedures. His fluency in Latin allowed him to engage directly with the learned treatises being produced by his court scholars, while his knowledge of both Norman French and English enabled him to understand how legal principles would actually work when applied to his diverse subjects. The king's court at this time was a fascinating mixture of ancient ceremony and cutting-edge innovation. On any given day, a visitor might encounter Normanites discussing the latest military techniques from the Continental Wars, English merchants seeking royal charters for new trading ventures, and learned clerics debating fine points of theology. The Great Hall of Westminster Palace, rebuilt and expanded during Henry's reign, regularly hosted gatherings that brought together representatives from every corner of English society. One of the most remarkable aspects of Henry's court was its deliberate cultivation we might today call intellectual diversity. Unlike many medieval rulers who surrounded themselves primarily with military companions and noble favorites, Henry actively sought out advisors and officials whose expertise complemented his own knowledge. He appointed scholars to important administrative positions, promoted merchants and craftsmen who demonstrated exceptional ability, and even elevated some individuals of humble birth to positions of considerable authority. This policy of promoting talent over birth created what contemporary chroniclers called the new men, individuals who owed their positions entirely to royal favor and whose loyalty was therefore absolute. These new men became the backbone of Henry's administration, providing the expertise and dedication necessary to implement his ambitious reforms. They also served as a counterweight to the traditional nobility, whose loyalty to the crown was often conditional and whose interests did not always align with royal policy. Among the most prominent of these new men was Geoffrey de Clinton, who rose from obscurity to become one of Henry's most trusted advisors and eventually the effective treasurer of England. Clinton's background was modest. He appears to have been the son of a minor Norman landowner, but his mathematical skills and absolute loyalty made him invaluable to the king. Under Henry's patronage, Clinton accumulated vast estates and enormous wealth, building the magnificent Kenilworth Castle and establishing a dynasty that would play important roles in English politics for centuries. Another significant figure was Ranulph Flambard, who had actually served William Rufus before transferring his loyalty to Henry. Flambard was a cleric of exceptional ability, whose understanding of canon law, civil administration, and financial management made him indispensable despite his somewhat questionable past. Henry's willingness to employ Flambard, despite his association with the previous regime, demonstrated the king's pragmatic approach to government. He cared more about competence than purity of motive. The success of Henry's administrative innovations can be measured not only by their immediate effectiveness but by their lasting influence on English government. The Exchequer system that Roger of Salisbury developed under Henry's direction would continue to serve as the foundation of English royal finance for centuries. The legal procedures established by Henry's itinerant justices would evolve into the English common law system that still influences legal practice today. Even Henry's methods of selecting and training administrators would become the model for professional civil service throughout medieval Europe. But Henry's court was not solely focused on the dry details of administration and law. The king understood that effective rule required not just efficient government, but also the kind of cultural prestige that would make his court a center of attraction for ambitious nobles, talented individuals throughout his realms. To this end, he patronized artists, musicians, poets, and scholars, creating an intellectual environment that rivaled the greatest courts of medieval Europe. The Royal Library at Westminster, expanded significantly during Henry's reign, became one of the finest collections of manuscripts in Northern Europe. Here were preserved not only the practical handbooks of law and administration that guided the king's government, but also the great works of classical literature, philosophy, and theology that formed the intellectual foundation of medieval civilization. Henry was known to spend hours in this library, reading and discussing texts with visiting scholars, and his personal annotations can still be found in some of the surviving manuscripts. Music played an important role in court life, with Henry maintaining a substantial establishment of professional musicians who performed both sacred and secular works. The king himself was reportedly an accomplished player of several instruments and took personal interest in the composition of new musical work. The elaborate ceremonies that marked important royal occasions, coronations, weddings, religious festivals, became showcases for the sophisticated artistic culture that flourished under Henry's patronage. Perhaps most remarkably, Henry established what was probably England's first zoological collection at his Palace of Woodstock in Oxfordshire. This royal menagerie, inspired by similar collections he had observed during his travels in continental Europe, housed an extraordinary variety of exotic animals brought from distant lands. Visitors to Woodstock might encounter lions from Africa, bears from the northern forests, exotic birds from far-off islands, and even, according to some accounts, a rhinoceros and several camels. The Woodstock menagerie served multiple purposes beyond mere entertainment. It demonstrated Henry's wealth and connections, showing that his kingdom had trading relationships that reached to the furthest corners of the known. It provided opportunities for scholars to study animal behavior and anatomy, contributing to the growth of natural philosophy. And it created a setting, the kind of elaborate court ceremonies that impressed visiting dignitaries and reinforced the majesty of English kingship. The daily life of Henry's court followed rhythms that balanced the serious business of government with the ceremonial and social activities that were essential to medieval. The king typically began each day by hearing Mass in his private chapel, accompanied by his closest advisors and members of his household. This religious observance was not merely ceremonial. Henry took his Christian duties seriously and often used these quiet moments to reflect on the moral dimensions of the political decisions he would face during the day. After the morning religious service, Henry would typically meet with his principal officials to review the previous day's business and plan the day's activities. These meetings might include Roger of Salisbury reporting on treasury matters, senior justices discussing legal cases that required royal attention, or military commanders briefing the king on security issues in various parts of the realm. Henry's habit of maintaining detailed knowledge of all aspects of his government meant that these briefings were often lengthy and sometimes quite technical. The formal business of the day would usually take place in the Great Hall, where the king would hold public audiences for petitioners, receive foreign ambassadors, or preside over important legal cases. These public sessions were carefully choreographed affairs that demonstrated royal majesty, while also providing opportunities for Henry to display his famous legal learning, administrative expertise. Contemporary observers often commented on the king's ability to grasp complex issues quickly and render decisions that satisfied all parties while advancing royal interests. Evenings at Henry's court were typically devoted to more relaxed activities. Elaborate meals that brought together the royal household and important visitors, musical performances, storytelling sessions, and the kind of informal conversations that often proved crucial to medieval politics. Henry was known as a gracious host who could engage knowledgeably on topics ranging from military strategy to theological disputes. And these evening gatherings often provided opportunities to build the personal relationships that were essential to effective medieval governance. The intellectual atmosphere of Henry's court attracted scholars and students from throughout Europe, creating what was effectively England's first university-level center of learning. Young men seeking careers in government or the church came to Westminster to study under the masters whom Henry patronized, learning not only the practical skills of administration, but also the broader intellectual traditions that informed royal policy. Many of these students would later establish similar centers of learning in their own regions, spreading Henry's educational innovations throughout medieval Europe. The influence of Henry's court extended far beyond England's borders through the network of diplomatic relationships that the king maintained with rulers throughout Europe. His marriage to Matilda of Scotland had secured his northern frontier while creating ties with one of Europe's most ancient royal dynasties. His daughter's marriage to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry V made him a player in the complex politics of medieval Germany and Italy. His careful management of relationships with the French crown helped maintain stability along Normandy's contested border. These international connections brought a constant stream of foreign visitors to Henry's court, each contributing their own knowledge and perspectives to the intellectual ferment that characterized royal gatherings. French scholars brought news of the latest developments in philosophy and theology from the emerging schools of Paris. Italian merchants provided information about new trading opportunities and financial techniques. German clerics shared insights into the ongoing struggles between papal and imperial authority that were reshaping the political landscape of medieval. The cumulative effect of all these influences was to make Henry's court one of the most sophisticated and cosmopolitan centers of power in medieval Europe. Here, the practical business of governing a complex kingdom was combined with serious intellectual inquiry, artistic patronage, and cultural innovation. The result was a form of royal government that was both more effective than its predecessors and more attractive to the talented individuals whose service was essential to successful medieval. But perhaps the most important aspect of Henry's court was its role as a training ground for the next generation of English leaders. The young nobles who served in the royal household, the clerks who learned their craft in the royal chancery, the knights who commanded royal forces, and the administrators who managed royal revenues were all being educated in Henry's methods and principles. When these men eventually assumed positions of authority in their own right, they carried with them the lessons they had learned at Westminster, spreading Henry's innovations throughout English society. This educational function of the royal court would prove to be one of Henry's most lasting contributions to English development. Long after the immediate crises of his reign had been forgotten, the administrative and legal principles established during his time continued to shape English government. The intellectual traditions fostered at his court contributed to the emergence of England as one of medieval Europe's most advanced and sophisticated kingdoms. The early years of Henry's reign, from 1100 to 1110, were marked by a series of challenges that would have tested the abilities of any medieval. His brother Robert's claim to the English throne remained a constant threat, supported by many Normans who viewed Henry's rapid seizure of power as illegitimate usurpation. The Church, while officially supporting Henry after his reconciliation with Archbishop Anselm, remained suspicious of royal intentions regarding ecclesiastical independence. Most dangerously, the complex web of relationships between English and Norman nobles created opportunities for ambitious barons to play both sides against each other in pursuit of their own advancement. Henry's response to these challenges demonstrated the full range of skills he had developed during his years of struggle and exile. Where military force was required, he could be as ruthless and effective as any Norman warrior. Where diplomacy offered better prospects, he displayed a sophistication that impressed even his enemies. Most importantly, he showed a consistent ability to learn from setbacks and adapt his strategies to changing circumstances. The first major test of Henry's kingship came with Robert's long-anticipated invasion of England in 1101. The Duke of Normandy had finally returned from the First Crusade, his reputation enhanced by participation in the capture of Jerusalem, but his treasury depleted by years of expensive campaigning in the Holy Land. He faced a stark choice: accept Henry's seizure of the English throne and focus on managing his Norman territories, or attempt to claim what he saw as his rightful inheritance by force. Robert chose to fight. In the summer of 1101, he assembled an invasion force that included many of the most prominent Norman nobles, veterans of the Crusades, whose military experience far exceeded that of most English defenders. The invasion fleet that crossed the Channel represented not just a military threat, but a political crisis. Many English nobles with Norman connections faced agonizing decisions about where. Henry's handling of this crisis revealed the full extent of his political maturation since his desperate days at Mont Saint-Michel. Rather than simply preparing for military confrontation, he launched a sophisticated campaign to undermine Robert's support before the invasion could gain momentum. He used his superior financial resources to bribe key Norman nobles, offering them English estates and titles in exchange for abandoning Robert's cause. He exploited divisions within the church, ensuring that ecclesiastical leaders would support the legitimate crowned king rather than a challenger whose claim rested solely on primogeniture. Most importantly, Henry demonstrated his growing understanding of English political sentiment. While Norman nobles might debate the relative claims of the two brothers, English subjects had no desire to see their kingdom become a battlefield for foreign ambitions. Henry presented himself as the protector of English interests against Norman adventurers, promising to defend the realm's independence and prosperity against external threats. When Robert's invasion force finally landed at Portsmouth in July 1101, it met a very different reception than the Duke had anticipated. Instead of English nobles flocking to his banner, Robert found himself isolated with only his most committed supporters. Henry had successfully neutralized most potential defectors through a combination of threats and inducements, while his control of the royal treasury allowed him to maintain forces that significantly outnumbered the invasion army. The two armies met near Alton in Hampshire, but the confrontation that many expected to reshape English politics ended not in battle but in negotiation. Robert, faced with the reality of his weakened position, agreed to the Treaty of Alton, which formally recognized Henry as King of England in exchange for substantial concessions. Henry would pay Robert an annual pension of 3,000 marks, abandon most of his claims to Norman territories, and recognize Robert as his heir if he died without male issue. The Treaty of Alton has been criticized by some historians as an expensive compromise that left fundamental issues unresolved but it actually represented a masterful piece of statecraft on Henry's part. By agreeing to pay Robert an annual subsidy, Henry was essentially purchasing peace at a cost that was easily affordable given England's growing prosperity. The recognition of Robert as heir was meaningless as long as Henry lived and could potentially father legitimate sons. Most importantly, the treaty gave Henry time to consolidate his position and prepare for future challenges. The aftermath of the treaty revealed the ruthless pragmatism that would characterize Henry's entire reign. While he had granted generous terms to Robert and the nobles who had supported invasion, Henry showed no mercy to English barons who had wavered in their loyalty or actively supported his brother's cause. A series of trials and confiscations followed, as Henry systematically removed unreliable elements from positions of power and redistributed their lands to more trustworthy supporters. Among those who felt Henry's wrath, William de Warenne, Earl of Surrey, suspicious correspondence with Robert. Despite his family's long service to the Norman dynasty, Warenne found himself charged with treason and forced into exile. His vast estates distributed Henry's supporters. The message was clear. Loyalty to the king would be rewarded generously, but disloyalty would be punished complete destruction. Even more dramatically, Henry moved against Robert of Bellême, perhaps the most powerful and dangerous of the Norman magnates. Bellême controlled vast territories on both sides of the Channel and commanded military resources that rivaled those of the crown itself. His family had a long history of rebellion against royal authority, and Henry had reason to believe that Bellême was planning another revolt that would coordinate English rebels with Norman dissidents. Rather than wait for Bellême to act, Henry struck first with characteristic speed and ruthlessness. In 1102, he summoned Bellême to court and confronted him with a list of 45 separate charges ranging from castle building without royal permission to harboring known criminals. The specificity of these charges demonstrated the thoroughness of Henry's intelligence gathering and his determination to provide legal justification for what was essentially a preemptive political strike. Bellême, recognizing that he faced certain conviction and probable execution, fled England for Normandy, abandoning his English estates to Henry's confiscation. The king's forces quickly occupied Bellême's castles at Arundel, Tickhill, and Shrewsbury, eliminating a major center of potential resistance while adding substantial military resources to royal control. The swift and decisive nature of this action sent shock waves throughout the English nobility, making it clear that Henry possessed both the will and the ability to destroy even the most powerful barons who threatened royal authority. These early victories established Henry's reputation as a formidable opponent who combined careful planning with ruthless execution. But they also created new challenges, as the king found himself governing a realm where traditional feudal relationships had been disrupted by his purges of unreliable nobles. The lands confiscated from rebellious barons had to be redistributed in ways that would strengthen royal authority while providing adequate reward for loyal support. Henry's solution was to accelerate his policy of promoting new men to positions of great, rather than simply transferring confiscated estates to established families. He often granted them to individuals whose entire careers depended on continued royal favor. These new lords brought fresh energy and absolute loyalty to English nobility, but they also created resentment among traditional families who saw their ancient prerogatives being distributed to upstart favorites. The most dramatic example of this policy was Henry's elevation of Geoffrey de Clinton, whose rise from minor Norman clerk to one of England's greatest landowners became legendary. Throughout medieval, Clinton's administrative skills and unwavering loyalty made him indispensable to Henry's government, but his vast accumulation of wealth and power also made him a symbol of the social that characterized Henry's. By 1105, Henry felt secure enough in his English position to address the ongoing problem of his relationship with Normandy. The Treaty of Alton had temporarily ended the military threat from, but it had not resolved the fundamental instability created by the division of their inheritance. As long as England and Normandy remained under separate rulers, the great noble family, with lands on both sides of the Channel, would face divided loyalties that could be exploited by ambitious rulers or rebellious barons. Moreover, Robert's government of Normandy had continued to deteriorate since his return from crusade. The Duke's financial resources had been exhausted by his eastern adventures, leaving him unable to maintain his fractious nobles or defend his territories against aggressive neighbors. Norman chroniclers describe a duchy in chaos, where local strongmen exercised independent authority and ducal writs were ignored. Henry's decision to reunify his father's inheritance by conquering Normandy was both strategically necessary and morally questionable. Robert had honored the terms of the Treaty of Alton, no immediate threat to English security. But Henry had concluded that lasting stability required the elimination of competing centers of, even if this meant destroying his own brother. The campaign that culminated in the Battle of Tinchebray in September 1106 was a masterpiece of medieval military and political strategy. Henry spent months preparing for the invasion, using his superior financial resources to bribe Norman nobles, his diplomatic skills to neutralize potential allies of Robert, and his administrative efficiency to assemble and supply a formidable invasion force. The invasion itself began in the summer of 1106, with Henry's landing at Cherbourg strategically positioned to cut off Robert's communications with potential supporters in southern Normandy. Rather than advancing directly on Rouen, the Norman capital, Henry chose to besiege the fortress of Tinchebray, forcing Robert to come to him on ground of Henry's choosing. The Battle of Tinchebray, fought on September 28, 1106, was one of the most significant military encounters of the medieval period. The two armies were roughly equal in size, each numbering perhaps 7,000 men, but they differed substantially in organization and leadership. Henry's forces included a large contingent of English infantry whose discipline and cohesion gave them advantages over the more traditional Norman cavalry that formed the core of Robert's army. The battle itself lasted approximately 1 hour, but its outcome would shape English and Norman history for generations. Henry demonstrated his tactical skill by initially fighting on foot alongside his infantry, inspiring their loyalty while presenting a smaller target for enemy cavalry. But when the moment came for decisive action, he remounted and led a cavalry charge that broke Robert's lines and decided the battle's outcome. The victory at Tinchebray was complete and devastating for Robert's cause. The Duke himself was captured, many of his principal supporters, while those who escaped the battlefield found themselves scattered and demoralized. Within weeks, the remaining centers of resistance throughout Normandy had surrendered, and Henry found himself master of his father's entire. But victory brought its own moral complications. Robert, despite his weaknesses as a ruler, was Henry's elder brother and a legitimate claimant to Norman authority. His capture at Tinchebray posed a dilemma that would test Henry's character and political judgment. Medieval precedent suggested that defeated rivals should be executed quickly to prevent future rebellions, but kinship bonds and Christian principles argued for mercy. Henry's solution was characteristically pragmatic but deeply troubling to contemporary observers. Rather than executing Robert, he ordered his permanent imprisonment, first at Devizes Castle in Wiltshire and later at Cardiff Castle in Wales. This decision allowed Henry to claim he had shown mercy to his brother while ensuring that Robert could never again threaten his authority. The imprisonment of Robert would last for 28 years until the former Duke's death in 1134. During this long captivity, Robert became a figure of some romance and sympathy, portrayed by chroniclers as a noble crusader, unjustly deprived of his inheritance by a younger brother's ambition. But Henry never wavered in his conviction that releasing Robert would inevitably lead to renewed warfare and instability. The moral cost of this decision weighed heavily on Henry throughout his reign. Contemporary chroniclers, while praising his military victory and administrative achievements, consistently criticized his treatment of Robert as excessive and unchristian. This criticism would intensify in later years, as Henry's reputation for cruelty became one of the defining characteristics of his historical legacy. But from a purely political perspective, Henry's conquest of Normandy was an unqualified success that established him as one of medieval Europe's most powerful rulers. The reunification of England and Normandy under a single crown eliminated the instability that plagued both territories since William the Conqueror's death. The vast resources now at Henry's disposal allowed him to pursue ambitious policies that would have been impossible for a ruler of either territory. The administrative challenges of governing domain that stretched from the Scottish border to the Loire Valley were immense, but Henry's governmental innovations proved equal task. The systems of itinerant justices, professional administrators, and systematic financial management that he had developed in England were gradually extended throughout his Norman territories, creating a unified governmental structure that was unparalleled in medieval. Most importantly, the conquest of Normandy marked Henry's emergence as a truly monarch whose policies could influence events throughout the continent. His domains now bordered those of the French king, the Count of Anjou, and the Count of Flanders, making him a key player in the complex diplomatic and military relationships that shaped medieval. The decade following Tinchebray would test all of Henry's skills, as this expanded role brought him into conflict with some of the most formidable rulers of his age. But the foundation he had laid through his early military victories, administrative innovations, and political restructuring would prove strong enough to support the greater challenges that lay ahead. On the evening of November 25th, 1120, as autumn winds swept across the Channel and darkness settled over the Norman coast, King Henry I prepared to return to England after conducting the business of his dual Normandy. It was a routine crossing, the kind of administrative journey become commonplace since Henry's conquest of the duchy 14 years early. The royal court had assembled at Barfleur, the same port from which William the Conqueror had launched his invasion of England over half a century before, and preparations were what everyone expected to be an uneventful voyage home. Among the royal party was Henry's most precious treasure, his only legitimate son, William Adelin, now 17 years old, and the undisputed heir to both England and Normandy. The young prince had grown into everything a medieval king could hope for in a successor: tall, handsome, brave in battle, and possessed of the quick intelligence that marked the Norman dynasty. Contemporary chroniclers describe him as combining his father's scholarly inclinations with the natural charisma that had made his grandfather, the Conqueror, such a compelling leader. William Adelin had spent the past several years being carefully prepared for kingship under his father's watchful guidance. He had studied Latin with the finest scholars at Henry's court, learning to read and write with the fluency that had made his father famous. As Beauclerc, he had trained in arms with Norman knights, whose families had fought at Hastings, mastering the skills of mounted combat that remained essential for medieval. Most importantly, he had accompanied Henry on royal progresses throughout England and Normandy, observing firsthand the complex art of governing diverse peoples with different customs and expectations. The relationship between Henry and his son was particularly close, marked by an affection that was remarkable, even by the standards of medieval royal. Henry had lost his own father while still young and had spent years struggling for recognition and position among his fractious brothers. He was determined that William Adelin would face no such difficulties, that the succession would be smooth and uncontested when the time came for the younger man to assume the crown. This father-son relationship was evident to everyone who observed the royal court. Henry included William in important policy discussions, sought his opinions on matters of state, and gradually began delegating significant responsibilities to prepare him for independent rule. The prince had already been granted extensive lands in Normandy and had begun to develop his own network of supporters among the younger generation of Normans. Everything pointed toward a future where the unity of England and Normandy would be maintained under strong and capable leadership. As the royal party prepared to embark on that fateful November evening, a scene unfolded that would be remembered and recounted for generations. Thomas Fitzstephen, the captain of a newly constructed vessel called the White Ship, approached King Henry with an offer to transport the royal party across the Channel. Fitzstephen was a man with impeccable credentials. His father, Stephen Fitz-Erard, had captained the ship that carried William the Conqueror to his victory at Hastings in 1066. The family had served Norman dukes for generations, and Thomas himself as one of the most skilled mariners operating in Channel water. The White Ship was indeed a magnificent vessel, newly fitted with the finest materials and designed according to the latest innovations in medieval naval architecture. She was faster than most ships of her size, more maneuverable than traditional cargo vessels, and equipped with both sails and oars to handle the changing conditions that could make channel crossings treacherous. Thomas Fitzstephen was justifiably proud of his ship and eager to demonstrate her capabilities to the royal family. Henry, however, had already made arrangements for his own passage aboard another vessel. Perhaps some instinct warned him against changing his plans, or perhaps he simply preferred the familiar comfort of the ship he had originally chosen. Whatever the reason, he politely declined Fitzstephen's offer for himself, but suggested that the captain might transport some of the younger members of the court who were eager to experience the White Ship's promised speed. This decision would prove to be one of the most consequential moments in English history. William Adelin, excited by the prospect of racing his father's ship across the Channel, immediately accepted Fitzstephen's offer. He was joined by two of Henry's illegitimate children, his half-sister Matilda Fitzroy, Countess of Perche, and his half-brother Richard of Lincoln. The young nobles of the court, caught up in the excitement of the moment, clamored to join the prince aboard the magnificent new vessel. What followed was a gathering that represented the future of Norman England. Among those who boarded the White Ship were Richard de Vranche, Earl of Chester, one of the most powerful and influential nobles in England; Geoffrey Riddell, a rising star in Henry's administration, whose family would play important roles in English government for generations; Othwell, who served as William Adelin's tutor and companion, a learned man whose guidance had helped shape the prince's character; dozens of other young nobles, knights, courtiers, many of them the sons and heirs of the greatest families in the realm. The atmosphere aboard the White Ship quickly became festive, with the excitement of the crossing combining with the natural high spirits of young nobles embarking on what they saw as an adventure. According to the chronicler Orderic Vitalis, whose account of the disaster provides our most detailed contemporary record, William Adelin called for wine to be brought aboard in abundance. The prince was in high spirits, eager to demonstrate that his ship could indeed overtake his father's vessel and reach England first. The wine flowed freely among both passengers and creating an atmosphere of celebration that proved tragically misplaced. Medieval ships' crews were experienced in handling their vessels under all conditions, but alcohol significantly impaired their judgment and reflexes at a time when precision and caution were essential. The November evening was growing darker, with limited visibility that made navigation particularly challenging in the treacherous waters around Barfleur. Some members of the court apparently recognized the developing danger. Future King Stephen of Blois who had initially planned to sail with the White Ship, decided at the last moment to disembark, reportedly due to a sudden attack of illness, though some chroniclers suggest he may have been disturbed by the excessive drinking he observed among passengers and crew. Several other cautious nobles followed Stephen's example, choosing to seek passage on other vessels rather than risk the increasingly chaotic scene aboard the White Ship. As darkness deepened over the Channel, King Henry's ship departed Barfleur on schedule, followed by other vessels carrying various members of the royal household. The White Ship remained in port longer than. As the celebration continued, an additional wine was brought aboard. Thomas Fitzstephen, despite his own consumption of alcohol, remained confident that his superior vessel could easily overtake the other ships and deliver the royal prince to England ahead of his father. When the White Ship finally set sail, probably sometime after midnight, she carried approximately 300 souls into the darkness of the Channel. The exact number will never be known, as medieval record-keeping was imprecise, and the passenger manifest included not only nobles and courtiers, but also servants, crew members, and various other individuals whose names were not carefully recorded. What is certain is that the ship represented one of the largest concentrations of young Norman talent and future leadership ever assembled in a single vessel. The initial departure went smoothly, with the White Ship's superior design allowing her to move swiftly through the calm waters near the Norman coast. Thomas Fitzstephen and his crew were initially confident that they could fulfill their promise to overtake the king's ship, and the passengers remained in high spirits as they settled in for what they expected to be a swift and comfortable crossing. But disaster struck with terrifying suddenness as the White Ship navigated the treacherous waters off Barfleur, where submerged rocks and shifting currents had claimed vessels for centuries. She struck the notorious Quillebeuf rock with devastating force. The impact was catastrophic, tearing a massive hole in the ship's hull and causing her to begin sinking immediately. The chaos that followed was indescribable. In the darkness and cold November water, passengers and crew alike found themselves struggling for survival as the ship went down with horrifying speed. The alcohol that had contributed to the festive atmosphere now became a deadly liability, impairing the judgment and coordination needed for effective escape efforts. Many of those aboard were weighed down by heavy clothing and armor that made swimming impossible in the frigid Channel water. William Adelin, despite the chaos surrounding him, initially managed to reach a small boat that had been launched from the sinking ship. For a moment it appeared that the heir to the English throne might escape the disaster that was claiming so many of his companions, but then, through the darkness and screaming, he heard the voice of his half-sister Matilda calling desperately for help as she struggled in the icy water. The decision William made in that moment revealed the character that had made him so beloved by his father and the court. Rather than fleeing to safety, the young prince ordered his boat to turn back in an attempt to rescue Matilda. It was an act of courage and compassion that epitomized the chivalric ideals of his age, but it proved fatal. The small boat was immediately swamped by other desperate survivors trying to climb aboard, and William Adelin drowned along with his half-sister and the others he had tried to save. Thomas Fitzstephen, the ship's captain, had managed to survive the initial sinking and found himself clinging to debris in the freezing water. When he learned from other survivors that Prince William had not escaped the disaster, the chroniclers tell us that he deliberately let himself sink beneath the waves rather than face King Henry with news of his son's death. Whether this account is literally accurate or represents the chronicler's sense of appropriate dramatic justice, it captures the magnitude of the tragedy that had befallen the Norman dynasty. As dawn broke over the Channel on November 26th, 1120, only one man remained alive from the White Ship disaster. Berold, a butcher from Rouen whose humble status had saved him from the heavy clothing and armor that had dragged down so many nobles, had managed to survive the night by clinging to the Quillebeuf rock itself. His survival was purely accidental. He had been aboard the ship in some menial capacity and had simply been fortunate enough to find something solid to hold on to in the darkness. When rescue ships finally discovered Berold and heard his account of the disaster, the full magnitude of what had occurred began to become clear. The White Ship had taken to the bottom of the channel not just the heir to the English throne, but an entire generation of Norman leadership. Among the dead were some of the most promising young nobles of the realm, future earls and administrators who had been carefully educated and prepared to serve in Henry's government. The loss represented not just a personal tragedy for the royal family, but a catastrophic blow to the future governance of England and North. The task of informing King Henry of his son's death fell to his courtiers, who understandably hesitated to deliver news that would devastate their master. Contemporary accounts describe how the court spent an entire day in agonized debate about how to break the news to a father who had invested so much hope and affection in his only legitimate male heir. Finally, a young page was chosen to approach the king and deliver the terrible message. The impact on Henry was immediate and overwhelming. The king, who had faced down rebellious brothers, conquered duchies, and imposed his will on fractious nobles, collapsed entirely upon learning of his son's death. Contemporary chroniclers describe him falling to the ground as if struck by a physical blow, unable to speak or move for several minutes. When he finally recovered his composure sufficiently to function, witnesses reported that he had aged years in a matter of moments and that he was never again seen to smile. The political implications of the White Ship disaster became apparent almost immediately. Henry was now 52 years old, an advanced age by medieval standards, and his only legitimate male heir was dead. His marriage to Matilda of Scotland had produced only two surviving children, William Adelin and a daughter, Matilda, who was now the only direct heir to his realms. The possibility of a queen ruling England in her own right was virtually unprecedented and certain to create massive instability when Henry eventually died. More immediately, the loss of so many young nobles created a generational gap in English and Norman leadership that would have lasting consequences. Families that had expected to see their sons and heirs assume positions of authority found themselves forced to promote younger or less experienced relatives. The careful balance of interests that Henry had maintained to various supporters was disrupted by the sudden disappearance of key figures who had been expected to play important roles in future governments. The psychological impact of the disaster on Henry personally cannot be overstated. The king, who had shown such ruthless pragmatism in dealing with political opponents, who had imprisoned his own brother for decades to maintain stability, who had built one of medieval Europe's most efficient governmental systems, was revealed to be a man whose deepest emotions were invested in his family relationships. The death of William Adelin exposed a vulnerability that Henry's enemies would attempt to exploit for the remainder of his reign. In the days and weeks following the White Ship disaster, Henry aged visibly in the eyes of his court. The energetic king, who had personally led cavalry charges and spent long days managing the details of government, became a figure of obvious grief and diminished vitality. He continued to fulfill his royal duty, but with a mechanical precision that suggested he was going through the motions of kingship rather than embracing its challenges with his former enthusiasm. The grief was compounded by guilt and self-recrimination. Henry could not escape the knowledge that his decision to allow William to sail White Ship rather than insisting that his heir travel with the royal party, had directly led to the disaster. In quiet moments, away from the public ceremony and administrative meetings that filled his days, Henry was reported to spend long periods in prayer, seeking both divine forgiveness and some understanding of why this catastrophe had befallen his family. The broader implications of the disaster extended far beyond personal grief. The White Ship had carried not just individuals, but the carefully constructed plans that Henry had made for the future of his realm. William Adelin had been more than just an heir. He had been groomed as the centerpiece of a dynastic strategy that would have maintained the unity of England for generations to come. His death meant that all of these plans had to be reconsidered from the beginning. The immediate question facing Henry was whether he could still father another legitimate man. At 52, he was not impossibly old by medieval standards. Men were known to father children well into their 60s. But his wife, Matilda of Scotland, had died in 1118, just 2 years before the White Ship disaster, and any new marriage would require careful negotiation to ensure that it strengthened rather than complicated his political. Henry's decision to remarry came swift, driven by the urgent need to provide his realms with a clear line of succession. In January 1121, barely 2 months after the White Ship disaster, he married Adeliza of Louvain, a young woman whose noble ancestry and political connections made her an attractive match. At 18, Adeliza was young enough to bear multiple children, and her family's position in the complex politics of the Low Countries could provide Henry with valuable allies in his ongoing struggles with France and other continental powers. The new queen was everything that could be desired in a medieval royal consort: beautiful, intelligent, well-educated, and possessed of the kind of diplomatic skills that were essential for managing the complex social relationships that characterized royal courts. She threw herself into her new role with enthusiasm, quickly mastering the intricacies of English and Norman court protocols, while building relationships with the noble families whose support was crucial to royal authority. But despite the apparent success of the marriage and the obvious affection that developed between Henry and Adeliza, the hoped-for heir did not appear. Months passed, then years, without any sign that the new queen was pregnant. This failure became a source of growing anxiety for Henry and his advisors, as it became increasingly apparent that the White Ship disaster might have permanently altered the Norman dynasty's prospects. The absence of a new heir focused attention on Henry's daughter Matilda, now his only legitimate child and the closest thing to a direct successor that he possessed. Matilda was a remarkable woman, intelligent, educated, and possessed of the strong will that characterized the Norman. She had been married to Holy Roman Emperor Henry V in 1114, making her the most powerful in medieval, with direct experience in governing complex territories and managing fractious nobles. But the idea of a woman ruling England and Normandy in her own right was virtually unprecedented and certain to create enormous political difficulties. Medieval society was built on assumptions about male leadership that extended from the family level through the highest reaches of political authority. A queen might serve as regent for a minor son or exercise informal influence through her relationships with male relatives, but independent female challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of royal authority. Henry, however, had little choice but to consider this possibility seriously. As the years passed, without a son from his marriage to Adeliza, it became increasingly apparent that Matilda might indeed be his only viable heir. The king began the delicate process of preparing both his realm and his daughter for this unprecedented situation, knowing that success would require overcoming centuries of custom and expectation. The first step was to secure Matilda's return to England from the Holy. When Emperor Henry V died in 1125, the widowed empress found herself in a precarious position within the complex politics of medieval Germany. Her late husband's death had unleashed a succession crisis that threatened to tear the empire apart, and Matilda's own position as a foreign queen made her vulnerable to the ambitions of German nobles who might seek to use her for their own political purposes. Henry's decision to recall his daughter to England was both a rescue mission and a strategic necessity. Bringing Matilda back to his own court, he could protect her from the dangers of German politics while beginning the process of presenting her to his own subjects as a potential ruler. The journey itself was a major diplomatic undertaking, requiring careful negotiations with various continental powers to ensure safe passage for the imperial treasure and household that accompanied the Dowager Empress. Matilda's return to England in 1126 marked the beginning of the most extraordinary political experiments in history. Henry was about to attempt something never been successfully accomplished before: the peaceful transfer of royal authority from a king to his daughter. The magnitude of this challenge was apparent to everyone involved, from the highest nobles to the humblest peasants, who would eventually be expected to swear loyalty to a queen regnant. The formal ceremony in which Henry presented Matilda as his heir took place at Westminster during the Christmas season of 1127. It was a carefully choreographed event designed to maximize the legitimacy and solemnity of an unprecedented decision. The great England and Normandy were summoned to Westminster and required to take formal recognizing Matilda as Henry's successor and promising to support her claim when the time came. The oath-taking ceremony was a masterpiece of medieval political theater, combining religious ritual, legal formality, and social pressure in ways designed to make future betrayal as difficult as possible. Each noble approached the throne individually, placed his hands between those of the king, and swore before God and the assembled court to recognize Matilda as the rightful heir to England and Normandy. The ceremony was conducted in the presence of leading ecclesiastical figures, giving it religious sanction, while the public nature of the proceedings meant that any future denial of the oath would be witnessed perjury. Among those who took the oath was Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew, and one of the most powerful nobles in the realm. Stephen's presence at the ceremony and his public acceptance of Matilda's succession seemed to provide crucial legitimacy for Henry's plans. As the son of Henry's sister Adela and a major landowner in both England and Normandy, Stephen was himself a potential claimant to the throne, and his apparent acceptance of Matilda's rights suggested that the succession might proceed smoothly. But even as the nobles swore their oaths and the ceremony concluded with appropriate solemnity, perceptive observers could detect underlying tensions that threatened Henry's carefully laid plans. Many of the nobles who publicly accepted Matilda's succession were privately skeptical about the practicality of female rule. Their oaths had been extracted under pressure and in circumstances that emphasized their dependence on royal favor, but their true loyalties would only be tested when Henry was no longer alive to enforce his will. The challenge of preparing Matilda for rule was complicated by the need to find her a new husband whose position and character would strengthen rather than undermine her claim to the throne. As a widow in her mid-20s, Matilda was expected to remarry, and the choice of her second husband would have enormous implications for the future of England and Normandy. Henry needed to find a man who was powerful enough to provide military and political support for Matilda's rule, but not so powerful or ambitious that he might attempt to rule in his wife's name rather than as her consort. After careful consideration of the available options, Henry chose Geoffrey of Anjou, the heir to one of France's most important counties, and a young man whose military abilities and political connections made him an attractive ally. The marriage, negotiated in 1127 and celebrated the following year, was designed to secure the southern borders of Normandy while providing Matilda with a husband whose resources could support her claim to rule. But the marriage between Matilda and Geoffrey proved troubled from the beginning. complicated by differences in age, temperament, and political experience that created persistent tensions between the couple. Matilda, now in her late 20s, and accustomed to the sophisticated court culture of the Holy Roman, found herself married to a teenager whose interests lay more in military adventure than in the subtle arts of diplomacy and governance that she had mastered during her years as Empress. The personal difficulties between Matilda and Geoffrey created political problems that threatened Henry's entire succession strategy. If his daughter and son-in-law could not work together effectively, their joint rule would be weak and vulnerable to challenges from rival claimants. Worse yet, any children born to the couple might find themselves caught between competing loyalties to their parents' different political traditions and territorial interests. Henry's efforts to manage these problems revealed both his political skill and the inherent limitations of his position. He could arrange marriages and extract oaths, but he could not compel genuine affection or cooperation between individuals whose personalities and interests were fundamentally incompatible. The aging king found himself increasingly dependent on diplomatic solutions to problems that might ultimately require military resolution. The birth of Matilda's first son in 1133 provided some relief from these concerns while creating new complications. The child, named Henry after his grandfather, represented the future of the Norman dynasty and a potential solution to the succession crisis that had plagued the realm since the White Ship disaster. Here was a male who could eventually rule both England, making the claim both his parents. But the baby's birth also raised questions about the immediate succession. Should Matilda rule as queen until her son came of age? Or should the boy be recognized as the direct heir, with Matilda serving as regent? How would Geoffrey's position as the child's father affect the balance of power with the royal family? These questions became more pressing as Henry entered his late 60s, and the prospect of his own death could no longer. The final years of Henry's reign were dominated by his increasingly desperate effort to ensure that his carefully crafted succession plans would survive his death. He knew that the combination of female succession, foreign influence through Geoffrey, and the general instability that typically followed a royal death would create opportunities for ambitious nobles to challenge his arrangement. The White Ship disaster had not only taken his beloved son, but had set in motion a chain of events that threatened to destroy everything he had built during his long reign. As we shall see, Henry's fears would prove entirely justified. The succession crisis that followed his death in 1135 would plunge England and Normandy into nearly 2 decades of civil war, as rival claimants and opportunistic nobles fought to determine who would ultimately control the heritage of William the Conqueror. The White Ship had indeed changed the course of English history, but in ways that extended far beyond the immediate tragedy of that dark November night in 1120. In the years following the White Ship disaster, as Henry grappled with the unprecedented challenge of preparing his daughter to rule in her own right, Matilda herself was undergoing a remarkable transformation that would prepare her for one of the most extraordinary political careers in medieval history. The young woman who returned to England in 1126 bore little resemblance to the girl who had been sent to Germany 12 years earlier to marry the Holy Roman Emperor. Matilda had been only 11 years old when she left her father's court to become the bride of Henry V, one of the most powerful rulers in Christendom. The marriage had been arranged as part of Henry I's complex diplomatic strategy to secure allies in his ongoing struggles with France and other continental powers. For the young girl, it meant leaving everything, her family, her language, her customs, to become part of an entirely foreign court where she would be expected to learn new ways and assume responsibilities far beyond those typically expected of medieval. The Holy Roman Empire that Matilda entered in 1140 was a vast and complex political entity that stretched from the North Sea to Central, encompassing dozens of different people, languages, and political traditions. The emperor's court was constantly on, traveling from one end of the empire to the other, as Henry V struggled to maintain authority over his fractious subjects. For a young woman from the relatively compact and unified realm of Norman England, this was an education in statecraft on a scale that few medieval rulers ever experienced. Under the tutelage of her husband and the sophisticated administrators who managed imperial, Matilda learned to navigate the intricate relationships between secular and ecclesiastical authorities that characterized medieval German politics. She witnessed firsthand the ongoing struggle between imperial and papal power that was reshaping political thought. She observed the complex negotiations between emperors and princes that were necessary to maintain even minimal unity within the empire's diverse territories. Most importantly, Matilda learned to exercise actual political authority in her own right. When Henry V led imperial armies into Italy to reassert German control over papal territories, he often left his wife behind to govern the German lands as regent. This was no ceremonial position. Matilda was expected to make real decisions about taxation, justice, and administration, while maintaining the loyalty of Germans who had little reason to accept the foreign queen. Contemporary records from the imperial chancery show that Matilda took these responsibilities seriously, issuing charters and decrees that demonstrate both her growing mastery of German political customs and her development of a distinctive governing style. She showed particular skill in managing the complex relationships between different religious communities within the empire, mediating disputes between monasteries and secular authorities with a diplomatic finesse that impressed even experienced imperial administrators. The death of Henry V in 1125 left Matilda in a position of considerable danger within German politics. As a foreign widow, with no children to secure her position, she was vulnerable to ambitious German nobles who might seek to use her for their own political purposes, or simply eliminate her as an inconvenient reminder of imperial policies they had opposed. The fact that she had accumulated substantial personal wealth and maintained her own network of supporters actually made her more dangerous in the eyes of potential enemies. Matilda's successful negotiation of this crisis demonstrated political skills that would serve her well in the even more challenging circumstances that, rather than remaining in Germany and risking becoming a pawn in imperial succession disputes, she chose to return to her father's court, bringing with her not only the imperial regalia and treasure that were her right as Henry V's, but also the invaluable experience of having governed one of the most complex political entities. The journey from Germany to England in 1126 was itself a major diplomatic and logistical undertaking that revealed Matilda's growing confidence and political sophistication. She had to negotiate safe passage through territories ruled by rulers who might view her wealth and connections as threats or opportunities. She had to manage a household that included not only her personal servants, but also German administrators and courtiers who had chosen to accompany her into exile rather than remain in an empire whose future was uncertain. The Empress who arrived at her father's court in Westminster was a very different person who had left 12 years earlier. Now in her mid-20s, Matilda possessed a combined political experience, international connections, and personal confidence that was virtually among medieval. She had governed territories, commanded armies, negotiated popes and princes, and survived the dangerous transition from imperial consort to independent political actor. But Matilda's imperial experience, while providing her with invaluable skill, also created challenges for her father's succession. Her years in Germany had accustomed her to a level of an independence that was unusual even for, and she was not naturally inclined to defer to natives or advisors traditions expected. Her direct sometimes imperious manner of speaking and acting struck many observers as inappropriate regardless of her rank or experience. Contemporary chroniclers, almost all male clergy, writing from culture that emphasized female submission, modesty, were often critical of Matilda's bearing, and they praised her intelligence and administrative competence, while simultaneously criticizing her for what they saw as excessive pride and an unwomanly desire for political authority. These attitudes would prove to be significant obstacles when Matilda eventually attempted to claim her inheritance as Queen of England. The formal ceremony in which Henry presented Matilda as his heir in 1127 represented the culmination of careful political planning that had been underway since her return to England. Henry understood that securing noble acceptance of female succession would require more than simple royal decree. It would need to be presented as both legally legitimate and practically necessary. The oath-taking ceremony was designed to create a sense of inevitability around Matilda's eventual rule, while making future resistance appear to be both treasonous. The choice of Westminster as the venue for this ceremony was itself significant. The great Abbey Church, site of royal coronations since William the Conqueror, provided an appropriately sacred setting for oaths that were intended to bind the soul as well as the political loyalties of those who swore them. The presence of leading ecclesiastical figures, including Archbishop William de Corbet of Canterbury, gave religious sanction to an arrangement that challenged traditional assumptions about the nature of royal authority. The nobles who gathered at Westminster to take the oath of succession came from every corner of Henry's dominions and represented every level hierarchy. Great earls, whose territories rivaled small kingdoms in their extent, alongside lesser barons, whose holdings consisted of single castles and their surrounding villages. Royal administrators whose power derived entirely from the king's favor took the same oath as ancient noble families whose ancestors had fought alongside William the Conqueror at Hastings. The most significant participant in the ceremony was Stephen of Blois, whose presence and public acceptance of Matilda's rights seemed to eliminate the most obvious alternative claimant to the throne. Stephen was Henry's nephew, the son of Adela of Normandy and Stephen Henry, Count of Blois. His mother was William the Conqueror's daughter, giving him a legitimate claim to Norman inheritance, while his marriage to Matilda of Boulogne had provided him with extensive lands and resources in both England and France. Stephen's character and abilities made him a formidable potential rival to Matilda's succession. Unlike his uncle Henry, who had spent years fighting for recognition and position, Stephen had grown up in comfort and security as a favored member of the royal. He was handsome, charming, generous in his dealings with others, and possessed of the kind of easy military courage that medieval nobles admired. His participation in Henry's court and his apparent acceptance of royal policies had made him one of the most popular figures in the Norman aristocracy. The oath that Stephen swore at Westminster appeared to settle any potential conflict between his own claims and those of his cousin Matilda. In the presence of God, the assembled nobility, and the king himself, Stephen publicly renounced any personal ambitions for the throne and promised to support Matilda's succession when Henry died. The solemnity of the occasion and the religious sanctions involved seemed to make future betrayal unthinkable. But even as the ceremony concluded with appropriate pageantry and expressions of unity, perceptive observers could detect signs of the troubles that lay ahead. The oaths had been extracted under pressure and in circumstances that emphasized the nobles' dependence on royal favor rather than their genuine acceptance of female. Many of those who swore allegiance to Matilda did so reluctantly, motivated more by fear of Henry's immediate displeasure than by conviction that a woman could effectively rule England. More fundamentally, the ceremony could not address the practical problems that would arise when Henry was no live to inform. Medieval kingship depended not only on legitimacy but on personal relationships, military capability, and the complex dynamics of feudalism that bound together the hierarchical society of the time. A female ruler would face unique challenges in maintaining these relationships and exercising the kind of direct, personal authority that effective medieval government required. Henry's solution to these problems was to find Matilda a husband whose position and abilities would complement her own claims while providing the military and political support that her rule would require. The choice of Geoffrey of Anjou was the result of careful analysis of the available options, balancing considerations of territorial strategy, family connections, and personal compatibility in ways designed to strengthen rather than complicate Matilda's position. The County of Anjou occupied a crucial position in the complex geography of medieval France, controlling the Loire Valley and serving as a buffer between Norman territories and the expanding power of the French crown. The Angevin counts had a long history of conflict with Norman dukes, but they also had reasons to fear the growing strength of the French monarchy under Louis VI. An alliance between Henry I and Count Fulk V of Anjou could serve the interests of both rulers, while providing Matilda with a husband whose resources and territorial position would be valuable assets in her future struggles. Geoffrey himself was an attractive candidate for marriage in many respects. Born in 1113, he was 15 years younger than Matilda, but old enough to provide immediate military leadership and eventual succession through male heirs. His education had been typical for a medieval, strong emphasis on military training, basic literacy, and the practical skills of territorial management. But he had also shown signs of the intellectual curiosity that characterized the Angevin family. His nickname, Plantagenet, derived from his habit of wearing a sprig of broom, Plantagenista, in his cap, suggested a young man confident enough in his own position to adopt distinctive personal symbols. The marriage negotiations between Henry and Count Fulk were conducted with the kind of elaborate diplomacy that characterized high medieval international relations. Every detail of the proposed union had to be carefully considered and formally agreed upon. The size of Matilda's dowry, the territorial arrangements that would accompany the marriage, the provisions for any children that might be born to the couple, and the complex questions of precedence and authority that would arise when two strong personalities attempted to share power. The formal betrothal ceremony, conducted in 1127, was almost as elaborate as the succession oath-taking that had preceded it. Representatives of both families, including high-ranking nobles and ecclesiastical figures, gathered to witness the exchange of promises that would bind the two young people together and create a new political alliance between England, Normandy, and Anjou. The ceremony was designed to demonstrate the importance that both sides attached to the marriage, while creating the kind of public commitments that would be difficult to abandon if political circumstances changed. But from the very beginning, the marriage between Matilda and Geoffrey was troubled by fundamental incompatibilities that created persistent problems for Henry's succession strategy. The age difference, while not unusual by medieval standards, was compounded by vast differences in experience and temperament that made genuine partnership extremely difficult to achieve. Matilda, now 25 years old, brought to the marriage 12 years of experience as Empress of the Holy, during which she had governed territories, commanded respect from sophisticated courtiers and administrators, and developed a strong sense of her own political importance and capabilities. She was accustomed to being treated with the deference due to one of Europe's most powerful, and she expected her new husband to recognize and respect her superior experience and status. Geoffrey, at 15, was barely past the age of majority by medieval standards, and had not yet had opportunities to prove himself in the complex world of international politics and territorial management. While he possessed the confidence and ambition that characterized successful men, he was naturally resentful of being expected to defer to a wife who, regardless of her experience and abilities, was still a woman in a society that assumed male superiority in all matters of governance and military leadership. These personal tensions were exacerbated by cultural differences between the German imperial traditions that had shaped Matilda's political outlook and the more typically French customs that prevailed in Anjou. Matilda's direct, sometimes imperious manner of exercising authority was perfectly appropriate for an imperial regent dealing with German princes, but it struck many observers as unwomanly and inappropriate when applied to relationships with Norman and Angevin nobles who expected more subtle and deferential behavior from women, even royal women. The early years of the marriage were marked by frequent separations and public disagreements that threatened to undermine the entire political strategy that Henry had constructed around his daughter's succession. If Matilda and Geoffrey could not work together effectively as a married couple, their joint rule would be weak and vulnerable to challenges from rival claimants who could present themselves as more stable and reliable alternatives. Henry's attempts to manage these problems revealed both his political skill and the inherent limitations of his position. He could arrange marriages and extract oaths, but he could not compel genuine affection or cooperation between individuals whose personalities and interests were fundamentally incompatible. The aging king found himself increasingly involved in mediating disputes between his daughter and son-in-law, trying to balance their competing demands while maintaining the appearance of family unity that was essential for political stability. The situation improved somewhat after 1131 when a temporary reconciliation between Matilda and Geoffrey was followed by the birth of their first son in 1130. The baby, named Henry after his grandfather, represented both the future of the Norman dynasty and a potential solution to the succession problems that had plagued the realm since the White Ship disaster. The birth of young Henry created new hope for the ultimate success of Henry I's succession plan, while also raising complex questions about the immediate arrangements for governing England and Normandy for the old king's death. Should Matilda rule as queen regnant until her son came of age, with Geoffrey serving as her consort? Should the baby be recognized immediately as the rightful heir, with his parents serving as regents? How would the territorial interests of Anjou be balanced against the established traditions and expectations of England and Normandy? These questions became increasingly urgent as Henry I entered his final years, his health obviously declining, and his ability to enforce his will through personal authority gradually diminished. The king who had once seemed indestructible was aging visibly, and the political calculations of his subjects were beginning to shift as they contemplated future without his dominant presence. The challenge facing Matilda as she prepared for her father's death was unprecedented in Median history. No woman had ever successfully claimed and maintained independent rule over territories as extensive and politically complex as England and Normandy. The few historical examples of female rule, such as the Byzantine Empress Irene or the legendary Queen Dido of Carthage, provided little practical guidance for the specific circumstances that Matilda would face. Moreover, Matilda's own character and political style, shaped by her year as Holy Roman Empress, were not well suited to the delicate negotiations and careful relationship management that would be necessary to maintain the loyalty of English and Norman nobles during a disputed succession. Her directness and confidence, admirable qualities in many contexts, would be interpreted by many of her potential subjects as arrogant, unwomanly ambition. As Henry I's reign drew to its close, The stage was set for one of medieval Europe's most dramatic political struggles. The scholarly king, who had brought unprecedented administrative efficiency and legal innovation to his realms, was about to discover whether his carefully laid plans could survive the harsh realities of feudal politics and gender prejudice that characterized 12th century society. The fate of the Norman dynasty and the future political development of England would depend on whether a woman trained to rule an empire could successfully claim and maintain authority over subjects who had never accepted female leadership and were not inclined to begin doing so now. As Henry the Froin entered the 1130s, now in his mid-60s and bearing the accumulated weight of more than 30 years on the throne, the king who had once seemed invincible began to show the first clear signs of mortality. The vigorous warrior who had personally led cavalry charges at Tinchebray, the tireless administrator who had revolutionized English government, and the shrewd politician who had outmaneuvered countless rivals, was gradually giving way to an aging monarch increasingly preoccupied with securing a legacy that would outlast his own death. The birth of his grandson Henry in 1133 by a second grandson Geoffrey in 1134 had provided some comfort to the old king as he contemplated the future of his dynasty, were potential heirs who could eventually unite the claims of both their parents while carrying forward the Norman tradition of strong kingship that had begun William the Conqueror. But the very existence of these infant heirs also complicated the already difficult question of immediate succession, raising new possibilities for conflict and division that Henry struggled to address. The relationship between Matilda and Geoffrey remained troubled, despite their apparent reconciliation and the birth of their sons. Contemporary observers noted that the couple continued to spend long periods apart, with Matilda often residing at her father's court in England while Geoffrey managed his ancestral territories in Anjou. This separation was partly practical. The demands of governing scattered territories required constant travel and attention, but it also reflected fundamental incompatibilities that threatened to undermine their ability to present a united front when Henry finally died. More troubling still was the growing evidence that many of the nobles who had sworn to support Matilda's succession in 1127 were having second thoughts about their oaths as the reality of female rule drew closer. The passage of time had allowed these men to observe Matilda's personality and governing style, and many had concluded that her imperious manner and obvious disdain for what she saw as English and Norman provincialism made her unsuitable for the delicate task of managing feudal relationships. The problem was particularly acute among the younger generation of nobles who had not been present at the original oath-taking ceremony. These men, many of them sons and heirs of the barons who had sworn allegiance to Matilda, felt no personal obligation to honor promises they had not made. Their loyalty would have to be earned rather than simply inherited, and Matilda's personality and political style were not well suited to the patient cultivation of support that this would require. Henry's awareness of these growing problems led him to make increasingly desperate attempts to shore up support for his daughter's succession. He required the renewal of oaths on multiple occasions, summoning nobles to court for elaborate ceremonies that were designed to reinforce their commitments while demonstrating royal authority. But these repeated oath-takings actually had the opposite effect from what Henry intended, suggesting to observant courtiers that the king was losing confidence in his own arrangements. The situation was further complicated by developments in Normandy, where Henry's long absence had allowed local grievances to accumulate and rival claimants to the ducal title to build networks of support. The most dangerous of these potential challengers was William Clito, son of Henry's brother Robert, and thus a legitimate claimant, Norman inheritance by traditional standards of primogeniture. Although William had died in 1128, removing the threat, his brief prominence had reminded nobles that alternatives to Henry's chosen succession existed. Even more ominously, whispers began to circulate about Stephen of Blois, whose oath to support Matilda had seemed to settle the succession question, but whose actual loyalty was increasingly questionable. Stephen had grown in wealth and power during Henry's reign, accumulating vast estates on both sides of the Channel and building a network of supporters who viewed him as a more attractive potential ruler than the imperious Matilda. His charm, generosity, and military reputation made him popular among exactly those nobles whose support would be crucial in any succession dispute. The deteriorating political situation was matched by Henry's declining physical health. The king, who had once seemed tireless, began to suffer from recurring illnesses that forced him to delegate more authority to subordinates, while reducing his ability to maintain the kind of constant vigilance that effective medieval rule required. His legendary appetite began to diminish, his energy flagged during long court sessions, and his famous memory for administrative details became less reliable. These signs of aging were noted by courtiers throughout Henry's dominions, and their reports inevitably reached the ears of ambitious nobles who were beginning to position themselves for the struggles that would follow the king's death. The very efficiency of Henry's governmental system worked against him in this regard, as the network of administrators and officials who kept him informed about events throughout his territories also ensured that news of his declining health spread quickly to potential rivals. Henry's last years were also marked by renewed conflicts with neighboring powers who sensed opportunity in the approaching end of his long. King Louis VI of France, despite his official reconciliation with Henry, began to probe Norman defenses and cultivate relationships with discontented Norman nobles who might support French intervention in a future succession dispute. The Counts of Flanders and Blois, traditional rivals of Norman power, similarly began to prepare for the possibilities that would arise when Henry was no longer available to defend his territories. These external pressures were compounded by internal rebellions that tested Henry's remaining strength and revealed the growing fragility of his authority. In 1135, a major uprising broke out in southern Normandy, led by nobles who claimed to be defending the rights of various rival claimants to ducal. Although Henry managed to suppress this rebellion through a combination of military force and diplomatic negotiations, the effort required resources and energy that the aging king could ill afford to expend. The strain of these final struggles was evident to everyone who observed Henry during his last months. The king, who had once dominated every gathering through sheer force of personality, now seemed diminished, relying increasingly on the ceremony and ritual of royal authority to maintain the respect that his personal presence no longer automatically commanded. His courtiers began to treat him with the kind of careful deference that suggested they were already mentally prepared for his death and the changes that would follow. It was against this background of declining health and growing political uncertainty that Henry made his final journey to Normandy in the autumn of 1135. The trip was ostensibly routine, another in the endless series of cross-channel voyages that had characterized his reign as he moved between his two realms to address administrative and military challenges. But contemporary observers noted that this journey had an almost ceremonial quality, as if Henry was making a final tour of his dominions before departing the stage of medieval politics. The court that assembled around Henry in Normandy during these final weeks included many of the figures who would play crucial roles in the succession struggle that was about to unfold. Matilda and Geoffrey were present, still maintaining their uncomfortable partnership while jockeying for position in the complex politics that would determine their future authority. Stephen of Blois was also in attendance, fulfilling his duties as a lord while perhaps contemplating the opportunities that Henry's death would. The gathering had an elegiac that reflected everyone's awareness that an era was ending. Henry had been king for 30 years, longer than many of his subjects could clearly. His reign had encompassed fundamental transformations in English Norman society, from the administrative innovations that had revolutionized royal government to the cultural developments that had made his court one of medieval Europe's most sophisticated centers of learning and artistic patronage. But even as courtiers reflected on Henry's achievements, they were also calculating decisions in the struggles that would inevitably follow his death. The king's carefully constructed succession plans, dependent as they were unprecedented acceptance of feat, seemed increasingly a moment of truth. The unity of England that had been Henry's greatest political achievement appeared likely to fracture once his personal authority was no longer able to hold it together.